and this is a CCRS support webinar. And we have the next 90 minutes to work with you and these folks. Kristine Kelly, if you want to come on camera and give us a wave. And Lindsay Poost is also here, our numeracy coordinator, as well as Liddy Rich from Metro East, our special guest star. Yay. I'm here. You've already met me, and Gail is also with us, helping out, making sure everything goes smoothly on the back end of things. So we are so glad to have this team. In particular, shout out to Abby Rosa with Ramsey County Corrections, who helped us with the big thinking and planning that goes into this webinar. So thank you to Abby for all of her work in helping make this happen and the really kind of conceptualizing what we could do around visual text. And with that, I will turn things over to Lindsay Poost.
Yes, hello. So today we are really excited to kind of dive into this topic, and I don't think any of us would consider ourselves experts, but just on the continuum of learning about this. So the objectives for today, to identify how a close reading routine can unlock meaning of visual text. You'll have some time to collaborate with peers, to sequence questions for a close reading of a certain visual that we'll be looking at. And then we'll have time to reflect, like how can close reading of a visual text be incorporated into my instruction, or if I'm already doing it, are there things that I can do to enhance that? So this is kind of the agenda for the day. We're going to do an activity at the beginning to kind of get us familiar with a certain visual that we will reference again later. But we're going to kind of get to be the students and answer some questions. And then Kristine is going to talk about some layers of close reading and what students are reading for and in what order, which is going to then inform the breakout group activity that we will be doing after we hear from the amazing Liddy Rich and an example that she has shared with us from her classroom and how she has put this into practice. So, and then after the breakout rooms, we'll have time for some wrap up and reflection. So first, you are the student, and we are going to take about 7 minutes or so to get acquainted with this graph here. And it was taken from a New York Times article. We're going to do this by answering typical questions that we ask our students. So we have this in the form of a Google Doc, and that link will be put into the chat shortly. But when you click on that link, it will ask you to make a copy of it. So you will have your own copy that you can edit, but we invite you to type your answers to those questions. And again, this is kind of what we're used to doing with students, and also we're going to see the same graphic later, so we'll already be acquainted with the meaning of it. So without further ado, Patsy, if you want to drop that link in. So if everyone clicks on that, again, it should make you, force you to make a copy of it so you can edit it. We'll take about 7 minutes or so, and then we'll talk about what we just dissected.
Lindsay, we did have someone just join us. I'm going to drop that link to the work that people are doing back in the chat.
Awesome.
Patsy,
Yes, welcome.
Yeah, and just to clarify, Patsy brought up a good point. This isn't a collaborative document. So as you're each opening your own copy, you'll each be doing your own work. And we might do this orally in the classroom. We might do this in different ways, but we figured this would be the most efficient way to kind of go through these typical questions.
Yeah, so take a few more minutes to look at those questions, and then we will reflect together. All right. I'll turn it over to you, Kristine.
Yeah, and watch those. I've said this in other webinars I've done. Watch those timers. If you're sharing the sound from your computer and it's up loud, a lot of them have sirens or other things at the end of them, which at one time during class scared the living daylights out of me and my students. So be sure you know what happens at the end of those timers. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with the last question, which is, and I have a feeling I know the answer, but some of us tend to use some visuals more than others or for certain purposes. Do you use charts and graphs or other visuals with all levels of students that you teach? Although some of you I know teach only one level, but there's quite a span. But those of you who teach multiple levels, I teach multiple levels. So do you use charts and graphs or other visuals? You can go ahead and use the chat box. And maybe perhaps what types of visual you tend to gravitate towards. I definitely gravitate towards political cartoons with my students, and have been right now for several weeks. So go ahead, and then I'm going to ask, as you put that in the chat box as far as if you use charts and graphs or other visuals and what kind you tend to use. Those of you who have already typed or are thinking that you might not chat on this particular one, what was similar to what you generally do? So Lindsay, if you would go ahead and bring those up so that we can see. We got that nice graph, and then we have questions, and these are not bad questions at all. That many of these are very good questions. But how is this similar? The types of questions and activity like this similar or different to what you do? And we can either have you chat, or you can, Lindsay, raise a hand or offer to talk in the chat box. We would love to hear your voice. We always do.
Yeah, this is awesome that it's actually kind of an intimate group. So if you do want to share something, if you could put me in the chat, we'll just know that that means, hey, I want to unmute, and then we will make sure to call on you.
And while you're thinking of who might want to share how this was similar or perhaps different, we've got bar graphs, yes, GED preparation, current events. Oh, there have been so many amazing COVID visuals, including interactive visuals, supporting lower level students, absolutely. More visual, yeah, I think I've learned a lot about using more visuals. Some resources, virus data. Yeah, it's been a great time to use some of that data. It depends on the data and the context. Mary Jo says, these are all text-based questions. Okay. Oh, the causes of stress. Multiple choice options. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I sometimes use a mix depending on the question. I may have some short answer and some really lend themselves well. Sometimes people say you can't get a good quality target a CCRS standard with multiple choice, but I think you can. It depends on the question. Remove information. Okay. Susan, do you want to say a little bit more about that? The slow reveal graph, kind of that idea. Susan?
Right. Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Yeah, I think it may have been a recent workshop I was at where we looked at just part of the graph, and it's like, okay, what's missing? What do you need? And it's like, okay, the title, or what do these numbers here mean, or what do these dates mean? And just to teach students what parts of the graph or the chart they need to focus on to interpret it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because those are questions that push the reader to think about how the text works. And one thing that interests me is I don't often have trouble saying, what is the text structure? Why does the author, introduce the text using this? Why does the author do this or whatever? But then when it comes to visuals and going, well, okay, asking those same, like, how does the graph work? How does the picture work? Those types of things. One of the things, Lindsay just put something, a slow reveal graphs. Mary Jo brought up that these are all text dependent. Are they all text dependent? Do students? Are they all text dependent? Beverly, which one? You put an ampersand. Don't you just love typing in the chat box? 7. What causes do you think contributed to the fall of bus ridership in these cities? We're kind of walking the line. Like, there are 4 cities here, right? So yes, there's Portland, there's Atlanta, there's Minneapolis, there is Miami. But we're asking students to bring quite a bit to that as far as thinking about different causes for bus ridership. Perhaps also number 8, what can you infer might be the future of bus ridership? These aren't bad questions at all. You want to be careful where you place them, which is something that we're going to talk about. Is there anything else about when you are, just as a lead in to this next part, how do you decide how many questions you're going to create, and how do you decide what order you're going to put them in? How do you decide how many? I tend to go way overboard till my students are begging me to stop giving them questions. And how do you decide the sequence or the order that you're going to put them in when they're working with a visual? Natalie, start with the most straightforward knowledge questions and move towards reasoning questions. Main idea needs tons of support for the lower level students. Yes. How else do you decide how you might order or sequence the questions that you're going to ask? That wasn't, my students right now would be saying, oh, that question isn't up on the slide. Say, yeah, but I get to ask any of the questions. I like to use increasing challenge. So right there, yeah, right there, that moves more up into maybe where they have to search in multiple places, and where they have to then move towards maybe using some of their background knowledge with the text, and then the kind of the query, the question answer reasoning relationships. Yeah, good. And this is something we talk about in the standards when we are talking about developing sets of text dependent questions, that we want to put them in an order, because order can be very important. Depends on what the purpose is, that the students are doing the reading, what the purpose is, what you want them to understand. But when we are close reading, we really want to think in layers. And sometimes we can do these layers at one time, and sometimes I've seen many examples of this where students do multiple reads, and each read they have a specific purpose or layer that they are reading for. And students can do this at virtually any level where they have enough language to be able to consider possible answers and say multiple choice, and where the knowledge is built. So we talk about this when we talk about close reading text. And, in all the trainings I do about creating text dependent question sets, I talk about, we want to build in sequences, and we want to look at layers. So what does the text say? This is the place for some of those key ideas and details, kind of getting the lay of the land. And I know that Lindsay and I have both done some things with like see, think, wonder, or notice and wonder, those types of things. The second layer is, how does the text work? So the craft and the structure, what are some of the moves that the person who created the photograph or the piece of artwork or the chart or the graph? I tend to ask these questions more about photographs or artworks or political cartoons, but not as much about charts and graphs and other kind of data visuals like that. And the third layer is, what does it mean? So this is where we can have them comparing visuals or visual and a text, where we have students really starting to synthesize some of the information gained, where we may add some additional information in a question that will help students move towards some kind of a higher understanding, purpose, those types of things. We do these things with text, and I do these things fairly easily with text, but the question is what are some great ways that we can apply this to the visuals? Because visuals are text, and any kind of text can be close read. So the idea is guiding students through these layers with any text that we use. Next slide. Many of you may be familiar with Fisher and Fry's model, the progression of text-dependent questions. And this is a suggested model when we are creating sets of text-dependent questions. So if I have students reading a text, I will usually always start with, if it's a multiple choice question, which of the following is the best main idea sentence, or just something about the gist or the main idea, moving into details, starting to take apart vocab, the structure of the text that we're looking at, the purpose. Many times students don't really think about purpose with visual information, my students are like, I get it with artwork, but they're like, is there a point of view, or is there, a purpose beyond just presenting data in a chart or a graph or other visual? And I'm like, oh, there's point of view in there, and there's a definite purpose that people share information in certain kinds of ways. That's kind of an eye opener for students. Making inferences, and then moving up to the top where they're making connections between things that they know and then the text that they read, or between text and other outside ideas. And so basically, go back one. So one of the things that we've talked about, and Abby and I and Liddy and Lindsay talked about this, is what understanding do you want students to ultimately unfold from the text? What is the summative understanding that you want students to be? Kind of like if you have an essential question, and how will you sequence questions, choose and sequence questions to build toward that understanding, towards students being able to fully answer that question or do that task successfully? Go ahead. So the reading standards that we're really talking about today, and that you will see today, are usually reading 1, which is the close reading standard, citing textual evidence, drawing conclusions. Reading anchor 2, looking at the central ideas or the themes, looking at how ideas are developed. Reading anchor 7, which is integrating and evaluating diverse media and formats, both print into visual, print into something more visual, and visual into print. And then reading anchor 9, which asks students to compare 2 or more texts on similar themes. And so these are really the 4 that we're going to be talking about today. Next one. And I have the pleasure of introducing Liddy Rich. And what was so great is when we started having a conversation with Liddy and Abby, Liddy said, oh my gosh, I've been working on this, and I just had an experience where I learned a lot and made some tweaks that resulted in something that really got my students engaged. And so we asked her, Liddy, you said about level B, but you like to try to push them into C?
Yeah, something like that.
Good for you. So Liddy's going to talk to us a little bit about something with visuals that she used with her level students, and some of the changes that she made and some of the ahas she had. Thank you, Liddy.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here today. So I don't know about the rest of you, but I was kind of absorbed this fall by the election, and paid a lot of attention to it. And it was, of course, a great opportunity for me to, like for probably many of you, to teach our students about how the system works in the United States. So the election comes along, we've been following it. We learned about the 3 branches of government and all of those things. And then it's time, the election happens, we count the votes, and there's the Electoral College. And so pretty quickly, I wanted to talk about, like, how do we count these votes? The New York Times has a great website called What's Going On in This Graph. And I've used their visuals a lot, since I've been teaching online. I used them less when I was teaching in person, but I imagine I will continue with that in the future. But they had a great series of maps about the Electoral College. And if you grew up in the United States, or those of us that have been living here for a long time, you're probably familiar with the Electoral College map that looks like this. Let's go there. That shows all of the states and all of the colors, the red and the blue. And we see this, I don't know, I can visualize it in my mind when I think about what the country looks like and where the red states are and where the blue states are. And when I show these, I'll show you map 2 in just a moment, but when I showed these 2 maps to my students right after the election, I said, well, what do you notice and what do you wonder? That's the questions that the New York Times asks us to ask about these things. And my students just sat there, and it was quiet for a really long time. And I tried to, push a little bit more, and I finally let go of it, and we just looked at the big numbers, the 232 for Trump and the 306 for Biden, and I let it go, and just chalked it up to, it was a bad day. It just didn't quite work. But as we know, the Electoral College doesn't just end on the day after the election. This year, we had the opportunity to have many more dates at least come to the front of our mind. And so at the beginning of December, when it was time for the Electoral College to actually do the voting, I thought, well, here's a chance for me to come back to a topic that we touched on. But most of my students haven't lived in this country for more than 3 years. Most are, been here for less time. So they getting this information more and more was useful. So I came back to these maps after we read a text about the Electoral College. But I knew that I had to slow down the process and help get them more engaged. So what I started out was I have the 2 maps. This is map number 1. I sent them all an email with both of these pictures, both of these maps. And then in class, I let them go back to that so that they could toggle on their computer. We did all the questions and things in class. So map number 1 is this one that many of us are familiar with. And map number 2 looked like this. And maybe some of you have seen it. Total information of how many votes went for Biden and how many votes went for Trump. It's still red and it's still blue, but it looks kind of different. And so I gave my students a bunch of text-dependent questions, having them just read these maps. Map number 1, we looked what's going on, really what do you see in here? What does the red on the map mean? What does the blue mean? Is there more blue? Is there more red or blue? And what do these shapes show? And my students were able to figure out, oh yeah, those are the states. They could find Minnesota, they could find Texas, they could find Florida. That's about it. But they could find these things and see those. And when they did the same questions for the next ones, they were really surprised because, if you look at it on the first map, there's a whole lot of red. And on this one, it's not quite so clear which there is more of. The question of what do the shapes show was a bit harder. So they're not quite as clear about the shapes of what they are. But the next questions, I had them comparing. I had them find Massachusetts on both of the maps and compare how they are the same and how they're different. That Massachusetts is up here in the Northeast. My students know Massachusetts is Teacher Liddy's home state, so that comes up into conversations regularly. It's this one here that looks like a hat. I had them do the same thing for Montana, comparing Montana. That's over here. It's big and red on this side, and it is quite a bit smaller here. And they were able to see the differences by comparing these two. And this is really about how did the person make these maps and make them look different. What is the goal here in these maps? There's really different things that we are seeing in them. A couple more comparison picture questions here. And this is the point where, so in my class, I had them going into breakout rooms and having these conversations with each other so that they could figure these out in conversation. I did not ask my students to write these answers because that was way more complicated. But it was at this moment where one of my students counted the number, the tenor electoral votes in Minnesota, where they had this huge aha about what all of these little squares meant and how they could show the same thing, but they're really showing something different. And she could really figure out and articulate how the Electoral College was working. It was pretty fabulous understanding that just got unfolded by going step by step and going really slowly. When they looked at the question about what can you conclude about the population of North Dakota, they could see that because there are only 3 votes, that meant that there were not many people that lived in this really big in the really big area. And that also felt like a huge understanding, because for me, it's so hard when I look at this map number 1 and see all of this red, it's hard to not remember. It's hard to remember that there are so very few people in all of this land. The final question that I asked was about in the New York Times, they have people write in, what would be a good title for this? So one of the people said, "Land doesn't vote, people do." Is that a good title? why or why not. So that got a whole lot more interesting conversation going between my students. And when they walked away, I felt like they had a lot more understanding of how the Electoral College represents people and represents all of the votes of the voters, not just the states. I was trying to figure out a way to help them understand the election and understand the electoral process, and that was my goal, was seeing what the how the Electoral College represents the people in here. So that's what I got.
So Liddy, can I ask you a question? So moving forward from that then, and having this wonderful aha experience, and I've told Liddy many times that that second map there, where with the squares, actually helped me a lot, but understand things. But so, what are some things you pulled forward now that you've kept in mind as you've been doing some other work with visuals?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think that with looking at these maps, you know, I was trying to figure out what is, you know, just as we ask when we're looking at a written text, where is the complexity? Where is the confusion? Where is the thing that I really want to make sure I highlight? And so kind of digging in, starting from there and then going backwards. If I want my students to see all of these little squares represent representatives, and representatives represent the population, how do I get to that? So if that's my final question that I want to unravel that, then I need to, like, well, how can I help them to see those pieces? Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. And I get a lot of questions from teachers about reading Anchor 9, which is really looking at comparing texts, and how important it is that we realize that there's a lot we can do with that, rather than just like two big texts. Like you can take a text and then pull in. I've made the suggestion for some teachers whose students often work out of like the Kaplan GED book, you know, looking at some of the topics and, you know, pulling some visuals and having them, you know, at hand if you're sitting down one-on-one with the student to kind of pull something in, like, well, here's a political, you're reading about this, and here's a political cartoon. Let's talk about and compare them together. Or it can be a visual and just a little bit of text, or just adding another visual. And this is really that work of 9. And you got some great comments here in the chat box, how helpful it was to have the maps side by side. And yes, and I agree with Dan always, it's so hard to hold back and let students figure it out for themselves.
Yes, really hard. Yeah.
And, you know, that is so much of that idea of putting the heavy lifting. Think of through the heavy lifting, what students were able to accomplish. Anyone have any other questions for Liddy or Lindsay? Do you have any questions now that we have Liddy here with her great example? I think it's a wonderful example, and an example of how you pulled in one more visual and it just changed. Backward design from what you are sharing, Liddy. Yeah, a higher level of complexity. And I think that one of the things that sometimes when I come up with a question and another teacher might say, that's a really hard question. How are your students going to answer that question? I'm like, well, I'm not going to give them this question right away. We're going to work at building up to this question. And that's that idea of backwards design.
And I just a comment. I loved hearing about the process that you were on, because I think I still, speaking about myself, I still hold myself to such a high standard, like the first time I try something. And so just hearing about the process of, okay, I tried this, I got silence, I wasn't quite sure, and then I redirected, I pivoted, and then enhanced the activity, I think is just a great reminder that we have the freedom to try things and then tweak them and enhance them and make them better.
Yep.
And I agree, that second visual helps me understand better as well. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, again, the idea of backwards design came up in the chat, and the sequencing. So this, all these comments are leading so nicely into an activity we're going to have you do, where we are going to start with the end in mind and practice sequencing questions. So we are going to move towards breakout groups, and with this idea of choosing and sequencing questions. Just a few pieces to set it up first before we do that. Just like, there were two maps, right? And Kristine was talking about Anchor 9, where we are comparing two texts, two visuals. That is what we want to do with the first image that we started with today. So we looked at that fall of bus ridership, and we want to add a text. So you will get this in a handout momentarily, but this is a text that was adapted by Kristine from the New York Times article, The Mystery of the Missing Bus Riders. So this text was with that graph, and she condensed it for the purpose of this activity, like we would for our students, tweaking it and altering it. So you will get this to read through, and then you will also have that visual. And this is that summative prompt that we want to work towards. So imagining we were giving this to students, and the ultimate goal is we want them to be able to synthesize information, and we want them to be able to discuss which causes of low ridership from the text you think were magnified during COVID-19. Additionally, based on your analysis of the text and the graph, how would you sketch the graph for the next 3 years?
Can I break in for a second, Lindsay?
Please do.
Can you go back to the text? And this developed, we were all looking at that wonderful bus ridership graph. And then we were like, boy, there's a lot almost here, but just looking at that graph, it had so much potential for the thinking that students could be doing with it. And it was a 4-page article, and so please don't knock me if it isn't super cohesive or anything. I did the best I could, but pulling some pieces out, because also within this that I think is important when we talk about pulling text and pulling visuals together is, for a lot of my students, they see a visual in a text or in a textbook, and they just kind of brush it off. And helping them to see, and this is great for those of you who are GED people, that the text often has important pieces that aren't in the visual, and the visual brings together pieces that the text doesn't necessarily do as cohesively, and they often work in tandem. And so this is the text is about at a high level C, but the question, the summative prompt, is a little bit higher, but we did something a little bit lower on the scale. And now just this idea of COVID-19, it isn't even mentioned in this text, but if this were the summative prompt, what would help to build that knowledge? And you are going to get an opportunity then, and this is in another doc. You're going to be working in breakout groups, and Lindsay's going to set that up. But we created a series of questions, a bunch of questions that you're going to take a look at, and that we did some different strategies with, creating along those 3 layers, and then also the idea of pulling in some outside information and making it part of the question so that students could make some connections based on a few things that weren't in the text or the graph, but that they could apply. So you're going to see some different types of things. They're not all perfect questions by any means, but Lindsay's going to lead us into that.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. And we know that, like, when we have time to hear an idea and then actually try and implement it together with some peers, it is easier to then go and try to tweak our own lessons for our students. So that's what we want to give you, is some play time and some discussion time. So this is the document that you will open up. Again, it is a document. It's a link that will force you to make a copy so that you will have your own. If you edit it, no one else will see it. So you can make changes. And so I'll explain the group work in a second, but what you're looking at is that text that was on the slide, as well as the visual again. and the summative prompt. So all of that text that we just showed you on these different slides, it's all on that one page that you need. This is that goal that we're working towards. And then we give you questions on this second page. They're just in bullet points. They're in no particular order. They're at all different levels of, level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, how does the text work? Level 3, what does it mean? There are all different levels. And the directions are, when you get in breakout groups, one person can share your screen. So we've enabled screen sharing. If you get into your breakout room and you have problems, just click for help or pop back to the main room, and we can certainly help. And we'll be going around to breakout rooms as well. But one person can share their screen, so you're all looking at the same document. And then your task is to choose no more than 10 questions. Again, not wanting to overwhelm students, to include in your set, and then put them in the order that you think best fits this layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, to guide students towards being able to discuss this question. So that is what you're going to be doing in your groups. There's going to be about 4-ish people per group. One person can share, and then you can just copy and paste these questions around and get rid of some. And I want that one. And maybe there's a question that you think should be on here that's not, you can add it. But just giving you some time to play and practice sequencing and talking through how do we effectively get students prepared to discuss this. So you will have about 15 minutes. We might extend it a little bit, but about 15 minutes or so. And I believe, yes, the link is in the chat. So you will have all the information you need with that link. And we will see you in about 15 minutes. Am I forgetting?
Well, wait, so choose somebody who's going to share their screen in the group. And again, these questions, it's not just being able to answer the summative question, but being able to understand the text well enough. So that's why you'll see vocabulary questions and other things. This is the same kind of activity if you were working with the text. This idea of sequencing and playing with the order of the questions is it's a great activity, and it really does make a difference what order that we put questions in. I will see questions that are in the order of where they appear in the text, and that may work for some purposes. But when we are really trying to build their knowledge with text-dependent standards-aligned questions, the sequence really does matter. So that's it. With no further ado,
I'm going to open the rooms.
People are coming in to the main room here.
Lindsay, would you lead this reflection slide, and then I'll talk about some of the things to consider.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
I just want to say too, like whenever we get into breakout groups and webinars, it's always like, most of the time it's like, oh my gosh, there wasn't enough time. I didn't finish. We just barely, figured out what we were doing, and then we were able to start but not finish. But I think regardless, I find that time helpful, even just getting started, because it starts to identify some of the questions or some of the problems or the challenges that I'm foreseeing, how it's going to relate and translate to my context. I start to identify that here in this space instead of forgetting about it after I leave. And so it helps me to even get started. So if you don't feel like you had enough time, I totally understand. But a couple questions to consider. We would love to hear some ideas in the chat. And yes, we can definitely resend that document. But what was similar, in that sequencing of questions and starting with a goal or a summative prompt and kind of working backwards or looking at comparing two texts, a text and a visual text. What is similar to what you generally do? What was different? An additional question: how did your group decide to keep this question versus this question, or how to put it in what order? if anyone is willing to share, you can put it in the chat, or you can type in the chat that you would like to unmute. Either way. We would love to hear from a couple groups. What was
We did
that?
give you a lot of questions, but we also wanted to use it as time to kind of model some different kinds of questions. Oh, Rosemary, yay.
Oh, you're not here. Let me, okay, now if you unmute, does it let you? There we go.
Okay, sorry, I misspelled too. However, one of the things that I like, Darcy in our group had us just sort of a T-chart, that there were questions only about the graph. And then there were very similar questions about the text. And then there were questions, we didn't get very far, but we were thinking about some questions for both of them. And I guess I liked that kind of an organization. I really thought that was a good idea.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I agree, because that list can look really daunting, or if you just start generating questions, it's helpful to have a T-chart to kind of sort things out. I love that. Anybody else? Okay, Ralu.
Okay, hi. So in our group, we kind of thought about putting in on those highlighted questions, what does the text say and how does the text work and what does the text mean, to make them as to put A, B, and C, and then write questions that belong to that area under it. So we thought something like, for what does the text say, to include what is the topic of the graph, what is the meaning of the word ride. Say, okay, I still cannot say it. Ridership. And then to the next one, B, to put how the text work. What does the graph help the reader to do? And then what does the text mean? It will lead us to what we want them to get out of it, which will have questions like, which city had the biggest decline? What is the main idea? What big event happened in 2020? How did the riding the bus change? What do you think is going to happen next?
I love that your sorting method was those topics, those layers, right? Those 3 layers, and then categorizing questions that way to try to lead students to being able to talk about that summative prompt. I love that. I also find thinking about those questions, framing it in those layers is very, very helpful. Thank you for sharing. And I see a comment here. We ran out of time. We were evaluating the questions to keep and which to remove. We didn't sequence those, but we did begin with a process, like how to determine whether it was a simple or more complex question. This is an area of instruction that I would say is weak for me, like how to sequence questions and what questions are the better wording of different questions for texts, and having students compare maybe a visual and a reading. But I love all of these starting points, because it's all focusing on all the different organizational methods you shared are just focusing on how do we critique, how do we think more about the questions we're asking our students, right? And I think that is so important for me. Yeah, it's Socratic questioning. Yeah, for sure.
I was going to say that, and I found, there's not, with this idea of when we talk about these three layers, a lot of work with the Common Core and then the CCRS talk about how key ideas and details really boil down to like reading standards 1 through 3 and craft and structure 4 through 6 and integration of ideas and knowledge 7 through 9. But I find, the inferencing is in, that first reading anchor 1. And I find that inferencing just kind of comes in all over the place rather than waiting, to bring that in. But sometimes things blend a little bit as well. But thinking about it again in terms of layers, I've been working on this with my students, and today I finally dropped a couple like Earth Day political cartoons on them with just a question: what is the writer's message about, or the cartoonist message? But up to this point, I've developed a thinking routine with them, like, what do you see? Okay, what symbols, what do they represent? What are the people in the cartoon saying? What are the words? What do they mean? These different things. And they freaked this morning and they're like, we don't know. And I said, what do I want you to do first? And they're like, what do we see? And gradually listening to them and pulling out that they have started to develop a routine for how to kind of peel back some layers. Because I said on the GED, you're not going to get 10 questions with a visual. You're going to get 1 or 2, and it's probably going to be the big one, like, what is the message, or what is the point of view of the cartoonist? So developing a little bit of a thinking routine, something they can hold on to for peeling those layers back.
And before going on to the next slide, I want to just echo exactly what you said and emphasize that, because that really was a huge part of the brainstorm for this session, was really how do we empower students to be able to do this on their own, right? How do we empower students to be able to look at a visual text and critically think about it and be able to extract that higher level thinking and meaning from a text when we're not there? And so we're not, they're not going to have 15 questions or 10 questions with them whenever they see a visual text. But if we are developing a sort of routine, these are the types of things you can look for first, and then analyze this part, like how did they put this together? What does it say? How did they put it together? And then maybe that meaning question is easier to arrive at.
Kind of like with text features, we want to teach students like there's a reason these words are in bold, and you have to look at the headings, right? And I've done some reading where it's even students starting college are like, I don't know what all the my textbook, really, does everything I see, everything in color, everything in bold, everything, all these charts, and I'm just going to skip past them and just read the text. That they don't even fully understand sometimes what the functions are of this visual information and how it connects to making greater meaning. So it's kind of some of that work. So consider the following, and you saw this in some of those questions, and I know I wish I'm a big proponent pushing forward that I want to do more workshops where it's like, this is what we're going to do, right? We're going to do this task and we are going to dig in, and then we're going to reflect on it. We're going to, and some time just to focus in on that task. Consider the following: add another visual text. Just think about a visual that you use and think and add another one. Add a short print text. It can be 2 or 3 sentences. It can be longer, but it can bring in an additional level of information. Add outside information into questions. So you noticed that some of the things that I did where I brought in this idea of the light rail, and I brought in this idea of between 2009, 2012, ride hailing services such as Uber and Lyft became popular. So more information that wasn't in the text or the graph, the idea of gentrification, or giving them some scaffolding in the question with e-commerce, for example. If E means electronic, trying to get them this idea of delivering goods and services, trying to put that together is figuring, out what e-commerce might mean, but giving them a little bit of scaffolding to do that. Work backwards from a big question. It came out in the chat box, that idea of backwards design. What is some ultimate question or understanding that you want students to have? Balance right their questions with questions about how the visual works and what it means. So depending on the purpose for reading, we may want to focus all the questions on just unlocking the main idea, right? But when we do an activity like this, we want to do some questions and that first layer, but we don't want to spend too much time. We want to give them the opportunity to build. That's why when we say like 6 questions or 7 questions or 10 questions, really thinking about the questions that we're using and the order we're putting them in. Use the same text-dependent stems and frames you use with print text. I mean, I keep, some of from the cohort, et cetera, that I keep these I keep these in sheet protectors where I've got my pyramid, my progression pyramid, and I've got all these different, stems and frames for text-dependent questions that I just grab. It's the same ones that we use with text. Hold on one second, Ralu, that's a great question. Use the 3 layers to develop a thinking routine. Again, with students, like my students don't have much trouble with literal questions about a chart or a graph. Like, what had the steepest dip, the steepest decline? Who had the lowest bus ride? I mean, these are ones they generally can answer pretty quickly. They really get stuck when they have to draw conclusions, notice trends, make predictions about trends, connect the information and that compare it with other information. That's where they start to really get stuck. So helping them to see that, yes, what do you see, what's going on, but then how does it work? And the choices that the cartoonist makes or the painter makes or the person who created the graph are just as intentional as the choices that a writer makes. And then how does it connect together and what does it mean? Do you want to field that question, Lindsay? Would you just use the graph? I know I would just use the graph. I might start with just using the graph and then pull in the text at some point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it really depends on what our ultimate goal is. What is that question that we are working backwards from? And I think only using visual text or only using that graph would be just fine, depending on what goal we have. So yes, I think the more our students see graphs and different types of graphs, right? Whether it's line graphs or there's multiple lines on one graph or bar graphs or different charts, I think it's important to be exposed to a variety of them. And there may not always be a text that goes with it, but it's an option. Yes, yeah, you're right. And if we're only using a graph, then there is no, you can't avoid it if that's what we're talking about. But yes, I think all of us are guilty of counting ourselves out when actually we really can do it. We just think we can't, or we think it's difficult. And so it can be hard to try.
Yeah, and our students can avoid those visuals, and they are such a huge part of adult life and such a huge part of the workplace and such a huge part of going on to college, the tests that we ask students to take. And so I talk to students just like with text. We read visuals and there are tools and they can learn to unlock. And that's really important. And that's why we're working a lot more on visuals. I've recently just begun more of the visuals and then bringing in a little bit of text and having them work, because I'm prepping them that idea of looking for what is present and what is missing in information comparing, I think is going to lay some groundwork for us doing more work on reading text and talking about what voices are present and what voices are missing in the narrative. And if we compare text together, some other things like whose voices are here represented, whose aren't, right? Why is it important that we use more than one source? There's more than one perspective. And
I just want to show this to you. We're not going to do any work with it we'll kind of enter our final wrap up soon, but I wanted to give another example. This is largely inspired by and informed by Abby Rosa. The link is in the chat. You don't have to go there. I'm actually going to project it on this screen, but you can take that link and save it for later. But just kind of walking through what is here, starting with a goal. This is talking about the surface area of a sphere and how I could have two different goals based on some visuals that I have, similar visuals. So this would be at a more okay, sorry, I'm losing my words. Calm, here we go. The first one I think is more accessible to level C learner, when we're talking about math, thinking about the idea of surface area. So having a couple different visuals, these visuals with a sequence of questions, getting students to kind of see, okay, the difference between the inside and the outside of the orange, and what are we talking about? And what does area even mean, and bringing in some other shapes that are not on the part of the original two, and extending this idea of the outside of a sphere, and that being the surface area. Okay, well, surface area isn't just about round things, even though I just had a series of questions leading them through coming to that understanding. But let's not stop there. If I just want to define what surface area is, then let's bring in some other shapes as well. And then can we ultimately come up with a student-generated definition of what does surface area mean? So that's like one goal, using that picture of an orange. The second one uses that same picture and another one to try to make sense of the formula for the surface area of a sphere. And without going too much in the weeds of the math, the fact that the surface area of a sphere is actually 4 times the area of a circle, you can see that in these pictures. Now, I want students to then be able to come to that on their own, but that is really what is happening. And so I love these visuals because it allows me to see, oh my gosh, if I were to peel this orange and then make the diameter of that sphere and make 4 of those circles, I could cover the area of all 4 of those. So there are some questions here to kind of just see an example of how might I lead students to understanding the difference between these formulas better, and having a better understanding of that versus memorizing it in a procedural way. So this is not a perfect document. You might think of questions that would be better to ask, or changing the wording or adding a question, but it is a starting place to kind of see this in another context.
Okay, so Lindsay's awesome. And it is really a great example. And I love this idea again of, this is an area to me that's so clear where math and ELA overlap. This close reading of, of math problems or math scenarios. It's just like a great, relationship there. And yes, thanks. We love Abby and Liddy. They've just been big thinkers with us on this, and we have a lot more big thinking. This is just very introductory. So what is a takeaway that you have? It can be either a takeaway about, going back and maybe adding something, or doing things in a different sequence, or maybe some of the questions prompted you at some different ways of asking questions, or how to develop more of a routine around this. You can chat it, or you can certainly ask to be unmuted. We always love to hear. So just one little takeaway from what we've done. I'm giving my wait time. I can definitely share one takeaway just recently from working with students and really trying to build a thinking routine is just seeing them today once I talked to them and reminded them that they have tools for unlocking the meaning, that we've worked for weeks on and off on these tools, and then seeing them run with it. It's pretty awesome. Great. So let's see. Appreciate the layers. Yeah, I do better when I can categorize things. It helps me a lot. Thinking about sequencing questions from basic to higher level, going deeper than just citing of facts from the visual. And you might have them, mostly cite facts that build to one higher level thinking question. And let's see, keeping in mind the summative prompt and working backward. I love the layers. I love the idea, and Liddy showed it, and I've done it with like a painting before or a photograph, where one of the last things I do is I reveal the title of the photo or of the painting or maybe of the text, and then ask students basically, is this a good title? Why or why not? Or now that you know the title, what information does the title give you that helps you further understand or that contradicts what you thought or something like that? Yeah, the layers, making it a routine to present new ideas and concepts is a great approach. Yeah, great. Charts and graphs have an author. Again, my students are like, no, it's just factual information. There's no bias behind, visual information. I'm like, oh yeah, there is. Thank you. Thinking about the process and question progression. Yeah, it just gives you more tools. Like we've given out a bunch of, like text dependent question stems and frames. And now thinking like in those layers, and that might make it easier. Like I really want to make sure that I'm hitting, each layer with a question or two. The ABC categories, sequencing the text dependent questions, the T-chart, I love that. And I also loved labeling with the different layers, like Ralu talked about, building routines, making predictions, talking about unknown variables. I think about when we first had that chart of the ridership, and then I'm going to have Patsy make a few announcements here. The ridership, and there it was as it stood, and it had so much potential. And then I think about, working with it and really digging in deep and where I could potentially go with it. And where I ended up with some of those questions was I didn't even know where I was going to end up, or that I was going to, pull out their thinking to that extent. And no, I wouldn't use all those questions together, but I bet I could find 8 to 10 in there that I would use. Thank you for all of your comments in the chat box. Patsy has some information. I'm sorry I didn't have my video on. Those of you, I'm not feeling myself today. I'm not feeling great. So thank you if I have not been participating as much as I usually do. Thanks to Lindsay, who's a great partner. Patsy, talk about some upcoming PD.
No problem. So yeah, just a few things that are coming up. We have a math webinar coming up on Tuesday the 4th, and we'll be exploring proportions conceptually using Desmos. And then a couple, actually 3 different adult career pathways things coming up. Kind of an introduction to integrated education and training, or IET, coming up on the 13th of May. If you or someone in your program interacts with manufacturing careers, we have a webinar, kind of a networking opportunity on May 19th, and we'll have Tim O'Brien from the Department of Labor, as well as Ron from Mankato, who works with manufacturing things in that area, speaking. And then if you're someone who's in the work of integrated education and training and is wanting to do either an enhanced version or a new version of a single set of learning objectives, which is the SSLOs, which is one of the requirements of an IET. We actually have 2 national speakers coming in, Caitlin Hamilton and Blair Wilson-Toso, who will be joining us from the East Coast to help us with that webinar. And that's coming up on June 3rd. And then just to be aware of, if you haven't heard already, the Summer Institute will again be virtual. It is the 18th and 19th of August. Proposals are being accepted and are due at the end of May. And then we do have a date set for a virtual Math Institute for September 24th. So save the date.
As you can see, IETs, we're definitely, that's being prioritized moving forward, is providing more support to programs and some more clarity, and particularly around those SSLOs. So you're going to see some focus on that. And yes, I hope you will consider presenting at Summer Institute. It is a great experience, and will be a tech team behind you. Thank you very much. Lindsay's on here too. Appreciate it. Again, this is just some initial thinking. Kind of, we're going to do a lot more thinking on this, and look at some other places we can go with it. But we thank you all for attending today. Lindsay?
Yeah, and just be sure to fill out the evaluation. Gail just put the link in the chat. That is how you will get your CEUs. So we do look at that feedback. It is very helpful for us.
We do. And I just want to thank Lindsay, Kristine,